The morning sun painted golden stripes across the old man's kitchen table as he slowly reached for his coffee cup. At 72 years old, Robert had the same routine every Tuesday morning for the past 15 years. His joints ached more these days, but he refused to let arthritis stop him from his weekly walk to Miller's Corner store. Robert had worked for the Postal Service for 35 years before retiring. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him as the friendly mailman who always had a smile and remembered everyone's names. His small house on Elm Street had been his home for 4 decades, bought when the neighborhood was full of young families and children playing in the streets. Things had changed over the years. The old families had moved away and new people kept coming in. Fancy coffee shops replaced the old barber shop. The corner laundromat became an expensive boutique. Robert didn't mind the changes much, but sometimes he felt like a stranger in his own neighborhood. As he put on his worn jacket and grabbed his canvas shopping bag, Robert looked at the framed photo on his hallway table. His son David smiled back at him in his Navy uniform, medals shining on his chest. Robert's chest swelled with pride every time he saw that picture. David was a Navy SEAL, one of the military's most elite soldiers. He had been away on a secret mission for months, and Robert missed their weekly phone calls. The old man had no idea that his son was actually on his way home, planning to surprise him that very afternoon. Robert locked his front door and began his slow walk down the sidewalk. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden, and he waved back with a warm smile. The morning air felt fresh, and he was looking forward to chatting with Mike, the store owner, about the weather and the baseball season. 3 blocks away, a police car sat parked behind a building. Officer Kevin Turner drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, already annoyed even though his shift had just started. He had been a cop for 15 years, but lately everything seemed to irritate him. The new neighborhood residents, the changing demographics, the paperwork, the complaints about his methods. Turner's radio crackled with a call about a suspicious person walking near 5th and Elm. The caller hadn't given many details, just said they saw an older black man walking around and it didn't look right. Turner rolled his eyes but started his car anyway. These calls were usually nothing, but he had to respond. Meanwhile, at the airport 2 hours away, David checked his watch as he waited for his rental car. He had managed to get emergency leave and wanted to surprise his father. It had been too long since they had spent time together, and David felt guilty about missing so many family moments because of his military duties. David was not just any soldier. He had completed some of the military's toughest missions and earned respect from commanders and fellow soldiers alike. But right now he was just a son who missed his father and wanted to come home. The rental car agent handed him the keys with a smile. "Visiting family?" she asked. "Yeah," David grinned. "Going to surprise my old man. Haven't seen him in 8 months." As David drove toward his childhood neighborhood, Robert continued his peaceful walk to the store. He moved slowly, stopping to pet a friendly dog and admire someone's flower garden. The old man had no idea that in just a few minutes, his quiet Tuesday morning would turn into a nightmare. Turner's patrol car turned onto Elm Street, and he immediately spotted the elderly black man walking with a shopping bag. Even though Robert was clearly just going about his daily business, something about the scene bothered the officer. Maybe it was the gentrification of the area, or maybe it was his own prejudices, but Turner decided this situation needed investigation. Robert noticed the police car slowing down behind him but didn't think much of it. He had lived an honest life, never been in trouble with the law, and assumed the officer was just doing his regular patrol. He continued walking, completely unaware that his son was racing toward home with a surprise visit, and that their family's life was about to change forever. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as 2 worlds were about to collide. An elderly father just wanted to buy groceries and maybe chat with his neighbor. A decorated son just wanted to surprise his father with a long-overdue visit. And a police officer was about to make decisions that would haunt everyone involved. Neither Robert nor David could have imagined that this ordinary Tuesday would become the day that tested everything they believed about justice, family, and standing up for what's right. The stage was set for events that would shake their quiet neighborhood and eventually make headlines across the country. As Robert approached the corner where Miller's store sat, he had no idea that his simple shopping trip would become the catalyst for a story about courage, community, and the power of family bonds in the face of injustice. Officer Turner pulled his patrol car to the curb just as Robert reached the corner. The elderly man was only 50 feet from Miller's store, the same place he had shopped for years. Robert heard the car door slam behind him and turned around, confused by the sharp sound. "Hey, you there?" Turner called out in a voice that was already aggressive. He adjusted his belt and walked toward Robert with the swagger that came from years of assuming he was always in charge. Robert stopped and looked around, wondering if the officer was talking to someone else. When he realized the policeman was addressing him, he felt a flutter of nervousness in his chest. He had always respected law enforcement, but something about this officer's tone made him uncomfortable. "Yes, sir," Robert replied politely, the way his mother had taught him to address authority figures decades ago. "What are you doing walking around this neighborhood?" Turner demanded, stopping just a few feet away. His hand rested on his belt close to his equipment, in a way that seemed more threatening than professional. Robert blinked in surprise. "I'm just going to the store, officer. I live here." He pointed down the street toward his house. "Been living on Elm Street for 40 years. Turner's eyes narrowed. He had received complaints before about being too aggressive, but he didn't care. In his mind, he was just doing his job, keeping the neighborhood safe. The fact that Robert seemed nervous only made him more suspicious. "Let me see some identification," Turner ordered, even though Robert had done nothing wrong and was clearly just an elderly man going shopping. "Of course, officer," Robert said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket for his wallet. His hand shook slightly, not from guilt but from the unexpected confrontation. He had been stopped by police only once before in his entire life, and that was for a minor traffic violation 20 years ago. As Robert fumbled with his wallet, Turner grew more impatient. "Hurry up!" "What's taking so long?" "I'm sorry, sir. My arthritis makes it hard to—" Robert began to explain, but Turner cut him off. "I don't want excuses. Just show me your ID now." Several neighbors had begun to notice the commotion. Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street, looked out her window with concern. She knew Robert well and couldn't understand why he was being hassled by the police. Her teenage grandson quietly pulled out his phone and began recording from the upstairs window. Robert finally managed to pull out his driver's license with trembling fingers. The plastic card clearly showed his address on Elm Street, proving he lived exactly where he said he did. But Turner barely glanced at it before handing it back. "What's in the bag?" Turner demanded, pointing at Robert's canvas shopping bag. "Nothing, officer. It's empty. I was going to buy groceries." Robert opened the bag to show it contained only his reusable shopping bags and a small notebook where he wrote his shopping list. Turner snatched the bag away and dumped its contents on the sidewalk. The shopping bag scattered and Robert's pencil rolled into the gutter. The elderly man watched in dismay as his belongings were treated like evidence from a crime scene. "Please, officer, I don't understand what I did wrong," Robert said, his voice getting smaller. "I'm just trying to go to the store. Don't give me that attitude." Turner snapped, though Robert had spoken respectfully. "I got a call about suspicious activity in this area." "Suspicious activity?" "Sir, I've been walking to this store every Tuesday for 15 years. Ask Mike, the store owner. He knows me." But Turner wasn't interested in facts. In his mind, he had already decided that Robert didn't belong in this neighborhood, despite the ID proving otherwise. The officer's prejudices had taken over his judgment. More neighbors began to appear. Old Mr. Kelly stepped onto his porch, and young Jessica from down the street paused her morning jog to watch with growing concern. They all knew Robert as a kind, gentle man who had never caused trouble for anyone. Turner noticed the growing audience and felt his authority being challenged. Instead of de-escalating the situation, he decided to assert more control. This was the moment when a simple misunderstanding could have been resolved with an apology and a handshake. Instead, Turner chose a different path. "Turn around and put your hands on that wall," he commanded, pointing to the brick wall of the building beside them. Robert's eyes widened in shock. "Officer, please. I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to buy groceries and go home." "Are you refusing to comply with a police order?" Turner's voice rose dangerously. The elderly man realized he had no choice. With his heart pounding, Robert slowly turned toward the wall and placed his weathered hands against the cold brick. He felt humiliated and scared, but he didn't want to make the situation worse. What Robert didn't know was that at that exact moment, his son David was pulling into the neighborhood, just 5 minutes away from the scene. David had stopped for gas and was excitedly planning his surprise, completely unaware that his father was about to face the most frightening experience of his life. Turner positioned himself behind Robert and began what he called a pat down, but was really an excuse to intimidate and humiliate the elderly man. Robert stood perfectly still, praying that this nightmare would end soon so he could just go home. The neighbors watching felt helpless and angry. They knew this was wrong, but they also knew that interfering with police could make things even worse. All they could do was watch and hope that someone in authority would step in to stop this injustice before it escalated further. What happened next would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Turner's frustration boiled over into something much darker and more dangerous. Instead of completing his unnecessary search and letting Robert go on his way, the officer decided to escalate the situation to a level that no one could have expected. "Stop moving," Turner shouted, even though Robert was standing perfectly still against the wall, his hands pressed against the brick exactly as instructed. "I'm not moving, sir," Robert replied quietly, his voice filled with confusion and fear, but Turner was past listening to reason. He grabbed Robert's shoulder and spun him around roughly. The sudden movement caused the elderly man to stumble, his arthritis making it hard to keep his balance. "You're resisting," Turner yelled, though everyone watching could clearly see that Robert was doing nothing but trying to stay on his feet. Mrs. Patterson couldn't stay quiet any longer. "He's not resisting," she called out from her porch. "He's just an old man." Turner's face flushed with anger at being questioned. In his twisted thinking, the neighbor's concern was just more evidence that he needed to assert his authority. He pushed Robert harder against the wall. "Please, officer," Robert pleaded. "I can't breathe very well. I have asthma." Instead of showing compassion, Turner interpreted this as defiance. He pulled out his baton, a weapon meant for serious criminals, not elderly grandfathers buying groceries. The neighbors watching felt their stomachs drop. Jessica, the young jogger, immediately started recording with her phone, her hands shaking as she realized what might happen next. "Put that phone away," Turner screamed at her, but she didn't stop recording. Turner raised his baton and brought it down across Robert's back. The elderly man cried out in pain and fell to his knees on the sidewalk. The sound of the impact and Robert's cry of pain echoed down the street. "Stop! Please stop!" Robert begged, trying to protect himself with his arms, but Turner had crossed a line that he couldn't come back from. He struck Robert again, this time across the ribs. The crack of breaking bone was audible to the horrified neighbors who were watching this nightmare unfold. Mr. Kelly couldn't stand it anymore. "Someone call 911, he shouted. "This is police brutality." Turner spun around, his face twisted with rage. "If anyone interferes, you'll be arrested too." But the neighbors weren't backing down. Mrs. Patterson was already on the phone with emergency services, and Jessica kept her camera rolling despite Turner's threats. They knew they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Robert curled up on the sidewalk, trying to protect his head and chest from the blows. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where he had hit the pavement. Each breath sent shooting pain through his broken rib. Turner grabbed Robert's arm and tried to force handcuffs on him, but the elderly man's injury made it difficult for him to cooperate. Turner interpreted this as continued resistance. "Stop fighting me," Turner shouted, even though Robert was clearly in too much pain to fight anyone. As Turner struggled with the handcuffs, he made a decision that would ultimately destroy his career and reputation. He pulled a small pocket knife from his own belt kit and dropped it near Robert's shopping bag, which was still scattered on the sidewalk. "Gun! He's got a weapon!" Turner yelled loudly, hoping the neighbors would hear his false claim and back up his story later. But the neighbors had seen everything. They watched Turner plant the knife, and their phones captured every second of his deception. Jessica zoomed in on the knife still in its packaging, clearly brand new and obviously planted. Mrs. Patterson's grandson got a perfect view from the upstairs window, showing Turner dropping the weapon himself. Turner keyed his radio with shaking hands. "This is Unit 47. I need backup immediately." Suspect was armed and violent. Had to use necessary force to subdue him. The lies came easily to Turner, who had clearly done this kind of thing before. But this time was different. This time there were too many witnesses, too many cameras, and too much evidence of what really happened. Robert lay on the cold sidewalk, handcuffed and bleeding, trying to understand how his simple trip to the store had become this nightmare. His chest burned with every breath and his head throbbed from hitting the pavement. "My son," Robert whispered through his pain. "Someone please call my son." But Robert didn't know that his son was already almost there. David had just turned onto the street where he grew up, excited to surprise his father, when he saw the flashing lights and crowd of people gathered around something on the sidewalk. As David got closer, his military training kicked in. He could see that something was very wrong. There was shouting, people with phones out recording, and what looked like someone hurt on the ground. His heart began to race, not with excitement anymore, but with a terrible feeling that his homecoming was about to become something much more serious than a family reunion. The sound of sirens filled the air as backup units responded to Turner's call. But they would arrive to find a scene very different from what Turner had described. They would find an elderly man brutally beaten, multiple witnesses with video evidence, and a story that didn't match the officer's report at all. Most importantly, they were about to meet a decorated Navy SEAL who had just watched his father become the victim of the very system that was supposed to protect him. David's rental car slowed to a crawl as he took in the chaotic scene ahead. Police cars, flashing lights, and a crowd of neighbors all gathered around what looked like an emergency situation. His first thought was concern for whoever was hurt, but as he got closer, his blood turned to ice. The man lying handcuffed on the sidewalk, bleeding and struggling to breathe, was his father. For a moment, David couldn't process what he was seeing. This was supposed to be a happy surprise, a reunion after months apart. Instead, he was witnessing his 72-year-old father being treated like a dangerous criminal. David parked quickly and got out of his car, his military training immediately taking over. Years of high-pressure situations had taught him to assess everything quickly and stay calm under extreme stress. But seeing his father hurt tested every ounce of that training. Turner was standing over Robert, adjusting his story for the backup officers who were starting to arrive. He didn't notice the tall, muscular man in civilian clothes approaching with the confident stride of someone used to command situations. "That's my father," David announced in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Turner spun around, surprised. He had been so focused on controlling his narrative that he hadn't noticed David's arrival. The officer immediately recognized the bearing and presence of military training, but it was too late to change what had already happened. "Sir, you need to step back. This is a police matter," Turner said, trying to regain control of the situation. David didn't step back. Instead, he knelt down next to his father, his trained eyes immediately assessing the injuries. Broken rib, possible concussion, cuts and bruises from the assault. His father's breathing was labored and painful. "Dad, it's me. It's David." "I'm here now," he said softly, his voice gentle despite the rage building inside him. Robert's eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented. When he saw his son's face, he almost thought he was hallucinating from the head injury. "David, what are you doing here?" Robert whispered through his pain. "I came to surprise you," David replied, his jaw clenched as he fought to control his emotions. "I'm here now. Everything's going to be okay." Turner realized he had a problem. Having a military family member appear was not part of his plan. He decided to try intimidation. "Sir," I said, "step back. Your father was resisting arrest and I had to use necessary force." David stood up slowly, his full height and military bearing making Turner take an unconscious step backward. When David spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that made everyone listen. "Necessary force?" David repeated, looking around at the scene. "Against a 72-year-old man with arthritis who was walking to the grocery store." The neighbors who had witnessed everything began speaking up, their voices overlapping as they told David what they had really seen. "He didn't do anything wrong," Mrs. Patterson called out. "The officer planted that knife," Jessica added, still recording. "We saw the whole thing," Mr. Kelly confirmed. David's eyes found the small knife lying near his father's scattered shopping bags. Even from a distance, he could see it was still in packaging, obviously planted. His military training and observation and evidence was making Turner's deception crystal clear. Turner realized his story was falling apart, but he was in too deep to back down now. "These people don't know what they're talking about. I was doing my job." David pulled out his phone and began recording as well. "I'm David Washington, Lieutenant Commander, Navy SEALs. This is my father, Robert Washington. and I'm documenting his condition after what appears to be an unjustified use of force." The other officers who had arrived as backup began to look uncomfortable. They had responded expecting to help subdue a dangerous suspect, but the scene they found didn't match Turner's radio call at all. They saw an elderly man clearly in need of medical attention and a crowd of upset neighbors with phones out. David continued recording as he documented his father's injuries, speaking in the clear professional tone he used for military reports. Subject shows signs of blunt force trauma to the torso, head injury consistent with impact with pavement, and obvious distress. No weapons visible except for what appears to be a planted knife still in its original packaging. Turner's face grew red with anger and panic. "Turn that camera off. This is a crime scene." "You're absolutely right," David replied calmly. "This is a crime scene. The question is who committed the crime." By now, more neighbors had come outside, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading quickly through the community that something terrible had happened to Robert, the friendly retired mailman who everyone liked and respected. David made his next move carefully. He pulled out his military ID and approached the senior officer among the backup units who had arrived. "Sergeant, I'm Lieutenant Commander Washington, United States Navy. The injured man is my father. I need to know why he was assaulted while walking to the store in his own neighborhood, where he's lived for 40 years. The sergeant looked at David's military ID, then at the scene, then at Turner, who was sweating despite the cool morning air. Years of police work had taught him to recognize when something didn't add up. "Officer Turner, what exactly happened here?" the sergeant asked. Before Turner could answer, David's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression grew more determined. "Lieutenant Rodriguez?" David answered. "Yeah, I'm back home, but we have a situation here." Lieutenant Rodriguez was David's second in command and one of his closest friends from the SEAL team. When David explained what was happening, Rodriguez didn't hesitate. "I'm 20 minutes away. Johnson and Parker are with me." "We'll be right there." David hung up and looked directly at Turner. "My team is coming. 3 more military personnel who are going to want to know why an elderly veteran was beaten on his way to buy groceries." Turner's confidence began to crumble. This wasn't going according to any plan he might have had. Instead of a simple case he could control, he now faced multiple witnesses, video evidence, and military personnel who knew how to document and report incidents properly. The ambulance finally arrived, and David rode with his father to the hospital, but not before making sure that every piece of evidence was properly documented and that the neighbors knew their witness statements would be crucial. As they loaded Robert into the ambulance, David squeezed his father's hand gently. "Dad, I promise you this won't be forgotten. We're going to make sure the right thing happens here." Robert managed a weak smile through his pain. "I'm proud of you, son. But be careful. Don't do anything that will hurt your career." David's expression was determined but controlled. "Don't worry about my career, Dad. Let's worry about getting you better and making sure this never happens to anyone else." While Robert was being treated at the hospital, David's phone was buzzing with messages. Word had spread quickly through his military network, and his fellow service members were responding exactly as he had hoped they would. Lieutenant Rodriguez arrived first, still in his civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a Marine. Behind him came Staff Sergeant Johnson, a Army Ranger who now worked as an engineer, and Petty Officer Parker, who had served 2 tours with David and was now a successful businessman in the city. They met David in the hospital waiting room, and their reunion was brief but intense. These men had saved each other's lives in combat zones around the world, and they weren't about to let one of their own face this battle alone. "How's your father?" Rodriguez asked immediately. "Broken rib, concussion, cuts and bruises. The doctors say he'll recover, but..." David's voice trailed off as he fought to control his anger. "What do you need us to do?" Johnson asked simply. David had spent the time at the hospital thinking strategically, the way his military training had taught him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice and making sure the system worked the way it was supposed to. "We need to document everything properly. We need witness statements. We need to make sure the evidence is preserved. And we need to make sure this gets the attention it deserves," David explained. Parker nodded. "What about legal representation?" "I've already made some calls," David replied. "My father needs the best civil rights attorney we can find. This isn't just about what happened to him. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to other families." The 4 men drove back to the neighborhood, where they found the scene had changed dramatically. News of the incident had spread through the community, and dozens of neighbors had gathered on the street where the attack had occurred. Mrs. Patterson approached them as soon as they arrived. "Are you Robert's son?" she asked David. "Yes, ma'am." "How is everyone holding up?" "We're angry," she said simply. "Robert is one of the kindest men in this neighborhood. What happened to him was wrong, and we all saw it." David introduced his team members to the neighbors, and they began the careful process of collecting witness statements. Each of the military men took responsibility for interviewing different groups of people, their training helping them ask the right questions and document everything properly. Jessica, the young jogger who had recorded much of the incident, showed them her video footage. The recording was clear and devastating. It showed Turner's aggressive approach, Robert's compliance, and the brutal beating that followed. "This is solid evidence," Rodriguez confirmed. "No way anyone can claim this was justified." Meanwhile, Johnson had discovered that Mrs. Patterson's grandson had recorded the entire incident from his upstairs window, including the moment when Turner planted the knife. The teenager was nervous about getting involved, but Johnson's calm, professional manner helped put him at ease. "You did the right thing by recording this," Johnson told him. "Your video might be the key to making sure justice is served." Parker was working with Mr. Kelly and the other neighbors who had witnessed the incident, helping them understand the importance of their testimony and making sure their statements were accurate and complete. David coordinated all of these efforts while also making phone calls to contacts he had developed during his military career. He reached out to civil rights organizations, veteran advocacy groups, and legal experts who specialized in police misconduct cases. By late afternoon, the small residential street had become a hub of organized activity. The military team had created what was essentially a command center, with each person responsible for different aspects of building a case against Turner. The local news had gotten wind of the story, and a reporter arrived to find not chaos but a well-organized group of people who knew exactly what they were doing. David spoke to the reporter with the same clear, factual tone he had used countless times in military briefings. "My father, Robert Washington, is a 72-year-old retired postal worker who was brutally beaten while walking to the store in his own neighborhood. We have multiple witnesses, video evidence, and clear proof that the officer involved fabricated his report and planted evidence." The reporter was impressed by David's calm, professional presentation of the facts. This wasn't an angry son seeking revenge. This was a military officer methodically building a case for justice. Rodriguez had contacted a civil rights attorney named Patricia Chen, who had successfully handled several high-profile police misconduct cases. She agreed to meet with David and his father that evening. Johnson reached out to the local chapter of the NAACP, whose president, Dr. Williams, immediately offered the organization's support and resources. Parker used his business connections to ensure that local community leaders were aware of the situation and ready to support the family. As the day progressed, Turner's story began to unravel completely. The body camera footage that had mysteriously malfunctioned during the incident was discovered to be working perfectly fine, and the video clearly contradicted his official report. The knife that Turner claimed Robert had threatened him with was traced back to a batch sold at a police supply store, and the packaging showed it had never been opened. Most damaging of all, Turner's fellow officers began to distance themselves from his actions. When faced with the overwhelming evidence and the professional presentation of the facts by David's team, they couldn't support Turner's version of events. By evening, David felt confident that they had built a solid foundation for seeking justice. But more importantly, he had shown the community that they didn't have to accept injustice quietly. Mrs. Patterson invited David and his team to her house for coffee, where they met with a dozen neighbors who wanted to know how they could help. "This isn't just about my father," David told them. "This is about all of us. It's about making sure our community is safe for everyone, and that people in positions of power are held accountable when they abuse that power." An older gentleman named Thomas, who had lived in the neighborhood for 50 years, stood up to speak. "Robert helped my family when my wife was sick. He brought our mail to the door every day because she couldn't walk to the mailbox. That man never hurt anyone in his life." The room filled with similar stories. Robert had helped neighbors, remembered birthdays, shoveled snow for elderly residents, and always had a kind word for everyone. The attack on him wasn't just an injustice. It was an attack on the heart of the community. As the evening ended, David looked around at the faces of his father's neighbors and his military brothers. What had started as a planned surprise visit had become something much bigger, a community united in the pursuit of justice. "Tomorrow we take this to the next level," David announced. "We make sure the system works the way it's supposed to work." The next morning brought a dramatic shift in the entire situation. David and his team had worked through the night, and by dawn, they had assembled a case that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore what had happened to Robert. Attorney Patricia Chen met with the family at the hospital, where Robert was recovering from his injuries. She was immediately impressed by the thoroughness of the documentation that David's team had compiled. "In 30 years of civil rights law, I've never seen witness statements this detailed or evidence this well preserved," she told them. "You've essentially done half of my job for me." Robert, despite his pain and medication, was sharp enough to understand the significance of what was happening. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he told the attorney. Meanwhile, Officer Turner was discovering that his world was falling apart. His fellow officers, who might have backed up his story in the past, were now distancing themselves from him. The video evidence was too clear, and the witness statements too consistent. Police Chief Williams, who had been hoping the incident would quietly disappear, found himself facing a media storm unlike anything the department had experienced before. The combination of clear video evidence, military family members who knew how to navigate the system, and a community united in outrage had created a perfect storm of accountability. The breaking point came when Turner's own body camera footage was, mysteriously, recovered by the police department's technical team. The video showed everything: Turner's aggressive approach, Robert's compliance, the unprovoked beating, and even Turner planting the knife. Detective Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had worked with Turner before, was assigned to review the case. She had always suspected that Turner's reports didn't always match reality, but this time the evidence was undeniable. "This is the worst case of police brutality I've seen in my career," she told Chief Williams. "There's no way we can defend this." The pressure was building from multiple directions. The local NAACP chapter had organized a peaceful protest outside the police station. Veteran organizations were calling for justice for Robert, a man who had served his community faithfully for decades. And the national media was starting to pick up the story. David received a call from his commanding officer, who had heard about the incident through military channels. "Lieutenant Commander, I want you to know that the Navy stands behind you and your family," the officer said. "What happened to your father is unacceptable, and you're handling this exactly the right way." That support meant everything to David, who had been worried that his activism might affect his military career. Instead, he found that his fellow service members admired his measured, professional approach to seeking justice. The real turning point came when the district attorney, Michael Torres, agreed to meet personally with David, his attorney, and the key witnesses. Torres was known for being tough on crime, but he was also fair, and he recognized that justice needed to be served regardless of who the perpetrator was. "I've reviewed all the evidence," Torres told them during the meeting. "Officer Turner will be charged with assault, filing false reports, and violation of civil rights under federal law." David felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction, but he wasn't finished yet. "What about the systemic issues? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Torres nodded. "That's exactly the right question. We're going to use this case to implement new training protocols, better oversight of officer conduct, and mandatory body cameras that can't be turned off." The news of Turner's arrest spread quickly through both the police department and the community. For many of Turner's colleagues, it was a wake-up call that the old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. Officer Lisa Park, who had been on the force for 5 years, spoke for many of her fellow officers when she said, "What Turner did was wrong, and it makes all of us look bad. We need to do better." The community response was immediate and powerful. The small neighborhood that had witnessed Robert's attack became a symbol of how ordinary people could stand up against injustice when they worked together. Mrs. Patterson organized a neighborhood watch program that would ensure incidents like this could never happen again, without being documented and reported immediately. Jessica, the jogger who had recorded the incident, started a social media campaign that brought national attention to the case and helped other victims of police misconduct find their voices. Mr. Kelly worked with local schools to create educational programs about civil rights and the importance of standing up against injustice, but perhaps the most significant change was in Turner himself. Facing serious criminal charges and the complete collapse of his career, he finally began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. His attorney advised him to accept responsibility and cooperate with the investigation, hoping for a plea deal that might reduce his sentence. "I know what I did was wrong," Turner said in a statement to the court. "I let my prejudices control my actions and I hurt an innocent man. I accept full responsibility for my actions. It wasn't enough to undo the harm he had caused, but it was a start toward accountability." Robert, meanwhile, was recovering not just from his physical injuries but also from the trauma of the attack. The outpouring of support from his community and the knowledge that justice was being served helped him heal emotionally as well as physically. "I'm proud of my son and grateful to my neighbors," he told a reporter. "They turned something terrible into something that might help other people." David's military team began to disperse as their individual lives called them back to their regular duties, but they had formed bonds that would last forever. They had proven that military training in leadership, organization, and justice could make a real difference in civilian life too. Rodriguez summed up their feelings as he prepared to return to his base. "We swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. That doesn't stop when we come home. It just means we protect and defend our communities too." The tables had completely turned. Turner, who had thought he could abuse his power without consequences, was facing criminal charges and the end of his career. Robert, who had been treated like a criminal, was being recognized as a victim who deserved justice and respect. Most importantly, a community had learned that they didn't have to accept injustice silently, and that working together with determination and proper documentation could create real change. The case was far from over, but the momentum had shifted completely. Justice was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming a reality. 3 months after the attack on Robert, the wheels of justice were turning steadily forward. The case had become a landmark moment for the city, sparking changes that went far beyond the punishment of one bad officer. Officer Turner's trial began on a crisp autumn morning. The courthouse steps were lined with supporters of the Washington family, including many of Robert's neighbors, veteran organizations, and civil rights activists who had rallied around the case. David sat beside his father in the courtroom, both men dressed in their best suits, presenting a dignified contrast to Turner, who looked smaller and more defeated than anyone remembered him being during his years on the force. The prosecution's case was devastating in its clarity. Video after video showed Turner's unprovoked aggression, Robert's compliance, and the brutal beating that followed. The planted knife evidence was particularly damaging, with forensic experts explaining how the packaging proved it had never been opened before Turner dropped it at the scene. Mrs. Patterson took the witness stand and described what she had seen from her porch, her voice steady and clear despite her age. "That officer attacked a good man for no reason at all," she testified. "Robert Washington has been a blessing to our neighborhood for 40 years. Jessica's testimony about her video recording was equally powerful. She explained how she had continued filming despite Turner's threats, knowing that documentation was crucial for justice. But it was David's testimony that brought the courtroom to complete silence. Speaking in the same calm, professional tone he used for military reports, he described arriving home to surprise his father, and instead finding him bloodied and handcuffed on the sidewalk. "My father served his community faithfully for 35 years as a postal worker," David said. "He never missed a day, never had a complaint against him, and was looking forward to a quiet retirement. Instead, he was treated like a dangerous criminal for the crime of being an elderly black man walking to the store." Turner's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had made an honest mistake under pressure, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges: assault, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Judge Martinez sentenced Turner to 3 years in prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to Robert for his medical expenses and trauma. But more importantly, the judge used the sentencing as an opportunity to send a message: This case represents everything that is wrong with police officers who forget that they are servants of the public, not its masters. Judge Martinez said, Mr. Washington was guilty of nothing except trusting that he could walk safely in his own neighborhood. Outside the courthouse, David held a press conference that was broadcast nationally. Standing beside his father, who had recovered physically, but still bore the emotional scars of his ordeal, David spoke about the broader implications of their victory. This case isn't just about my father, and it's not just about Officer Turner, he said. It's about whether we're going to accept a society where people can be brutalized by those sworn to protect them, or whether we're going to demand better. The media attention had brought the case to the notice of federal authorities, who announced their own investigation into the police department's practices. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a comprehensive review of the department's training, oversight, and complaint procedures. This federal scrutiny led to dramatic changes in how the police department operated. Chief Williams, realizing that his department's reputation was at stake, implemented sweeping reforms. All officers were required to undergo extensive retraining in de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Body cameras became mandatory for all interactions with the public, with severe penalties for officers who turned them off inappropriately. A civilian oversight board was established, with the power to investigate complaints against officers and recommend disciplinary action. The board included community representatives, legal experts, and retired law enforcement officials who were committed to accountability. Perhaps most importantly, the department established a partnership with local veteran organizations to provide additional training to officers. David agreed to help develop a program that taught police officers the same rules of engagement that military personnel used in combat zones. If soldiers in a war zone can show restraint and follow proper procedures, police officers in American neighborhoods should be able to do the same, David explained to the first class of officers who underwent the new training. The changes weren't limited to law enforcement. Robert's case had inspired community organizations throughout the city to become more active in monitoring police conduct and advocating for citizens' rights. Mrs. Patterson started a neighborhood watch program that focused not just on crime prevention, but also on documenting any instances of police misconduct. Similar programs spread to other communities, creating a network of citizen oversight that made it much harder for bad officers to abuse their power. Jessica used her social media skills to create an app that allowed citizens to quickly report and document police encounters, with features that automatically uploaded video to secure cloud storage to prevent tampering. Dr. Williams from the NAACP organized regular forums where community members could meet with police officials to discuss concerns and suggestions for improvement. The legal victory also had financial implications that went beyond Turner's sentence. Attorney Patricia Chen filed a successful civil lawsuit against the city, resulting in a substantial settlement that not only compensated Robert for his suffering, but also funded community programs aimed at preventing future incidents. Part of the settlement money was used to establish a community center where young people could learn about their civil rights and how to interact safely with law enforcement. Robert, despite his ordeal, agreed to volunteer at the center, sharing his story to help educate the next generation. "I don't want other families to go through what we went through," Robert told the young people who came to hear him speak. "But I also want you to know that when injustice happens, there are people who will stand up and fight for what's right." The ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Other victims of police misconduct came forward, inspired by the Washington family's success in seeking justice. Some of these cases resulted in additional officer prosecutions, while others led to policy changes and improved training. David found himself in demand as a speaker at law enforcement conferences, where he shared his perspective on how military, discipline, and civilian oversight could work together to create better policing. His message was always the same. Serving in uniform, whether military or police, is about protecting people, not hurting them. When we forget that, we betray everything the uniform is supposed to represent. The case had transformed from a single incident of brutality into a catalyst for systemic change. Turner's conviction was just the beginning. The real victory was in the lasting improvements to how police served the community. As the first anniversary of the attack approached, Robert reflected on how much had changed. His physical injuries had healed, but more importantly, He had seen his community come together to demand justice and create positive change. Sometimes terrible things happen for reasons we can't understand, he said. But when good people refuse to accept injustice, something beautiful can grow from something ugly. 1 year after the attack that changed everything, Robert stood in his kitchen making coffee just as he had done countless mornings before. But this morning was different. Today marked the anniversary of the worst day of his life, but also the beginning of changes that had made his community stronger and safer. The morning sun streamed through his window as he looked at the framed newspaper clipping on his kitchen table. The headline read, "Local Police Department wins National Award for Community Relations Reform." It was hard to believe that such positive change had grown from such a terrible incident. David had returned home the night before, taking leave from his military duties to spend the anniversary with his father. Their relationship, already strong, had deepened through their shared experience of fighting for justice together. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" David asked as he joined Robert in the kitchen. "Grateful," Robert replied simply, "not for what happened, but for everything that came after." They walked together to Miller's Corner store, the same route Robert had taken that fateful Tuesday morning. But now the walk felt different. Neighbors waved and called out greetings from their yards. The community that had rallied around Robert during his darkest hour had become closer and more connected than ever before. Mrs. Patterson was working in her garden and looked up to wave. Her grandson, now a freshman in college, was home for the weekend and studying criminal justice, inspired by what he had witnessed and documented that day. At the store, Mike, the owner, greeted Robert with a warm handshake. "The usual Tuesday shopping trip?" he asked with a smile. "Some traditions are worth keeping," Robert replied, thinking about how this simple routine had been threatened but not destroyed by one man's hatred. As they walked back home, David reflected on how the case had affected his own military career. Rather than harming his prospects, his professional handling of the situation had earned him respect from his superiors and recognition for his leadership skills. "I got word yesterday that I'm being recommended for a promotion," David told his father. "They said my actions during this whole situation showed the kind of leadership the Navy needs." Robert beamed with pride. "Your mother would be so proud of both of us," he said, referring to David's mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier. That afternoon, they attended the opening of the Robert Washington Community Center, the facility that had been built with funds from the Civil Rights Settlement. The center offered programs for young people, job training for adults, and resources for families dealing with legal issues. Dr. Williams from the NAACP spoke at the dedication ceremony. "This center represents what can happen when a community refuses to let injustice have the last word," he said. Robert's courage in speaking out, and David's leadership in organizing the response, have created something that will benefit families for generations. Attorney Patricia Chen was also there, having become a close friend of the family over the past year. She had used the publicity from Robert's case to take on several other police misconduct cases, winning justice for families who might otherwise have had no voice. "The Washington case set a precedent," she explained to the gathered crowd. "It showed that with proper documentation, community support, and determination, even ordinary citizens can hold powerful institutions accountable." Former Officer Turner was not at the ceremony, of course. He was serving his prison sentence and had lost his pension, his reputation, and his freedom. Some people felt sorry for him, but most agreed that justice had been served. His downfall had served as a warning to other officers who might be tempted to abuse their power. The new police chief, Maria Rodriguez, no relation to David's military colleague, had been brought in from another city specifically to continue the reforms that Robert's case had initiated. She had implemented even more changes, including regular community meetings, enhanced mental health support for officers, and partnerships with local organizations. "The Washington case taught us that policing isn't about power over people," Chief Rodriguez said during her speech at the community center opening. "It's about serving alongside people to keep everyone safe." As the ceremony concluded, David was approached by a young police officer named Thompson, who had graduated from the academy after the new training programs were implemented. "I wanted to thank you and your father," Officer Thompson said. "The training I received because of your case made me a better officer." I know how to de-escalate situations and treat every person with dignity. This was exactly what David had hoped would come from their fight for justice, not just punishment for one bad officer, but systemic changes that would prevent future incidents. That evening, the family gathered for dinner with the neighbors who had become like extended family through their shared experience. Mrs. Patterson brought her famous apple pie. Jessica shared stories from her new job working with a police reform organization, and Mr. Kelly talked about the neighborhood watch program that had expanded to cover the entire district. As they sat around Robert's dinner table, the conversation naturally turned to the changes they had witnessed over the past year. "It's amazing how much has changed," Jessica observed. "The police department, the community, even the way people think about standing up for what's right. The best part," Mrs. Patterson added, "is that young people are learning they don't have to accept injustice. They're learning they have power when they work together." Robert listened to his friends and neighbors talk, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The physical scars from his attack had healed, but more importantly, the emotional wounds had been transformed into something positive. "You know," he said to the group, "I wouldn't choose to go through what happened to me again. But I'm proud of what we all accomplished together. We proved that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they refuse to give up." David raised his glass of iced tea in a toast, to Dad for his courage, to our neighbors for their support, and to everyone who believes that justice isn't just an idea, it's something we have to work for every day. As the evening wound down and the neighbors began to head home, David and Robert sat on the front porch looking out at their quiet street. The same street where a terrible injustice had occurred was now a symbol of community strength and positive change. "Do you think we made a difference?" Robert asked his son. David looked around at the peaceful neighborhood, thought about the reformed police department, the new community center, and all the lives that had been touched by their story. "Dad, we didn't just make a difference," he replied. "We changed everything." A year later, Robert Washington was no longer just a retired postal worker who had been the victim of police brutality. He was a symbol of resilience, a catalyst for change, and proof that one person's courage to speak out could inspire an entire community to demand better. And David was no longer just a Navy SEAL on leave to visit his father. He was a son who had shown that military training in leadership and justice could be used to protect not just national security, but community safety and civil rights. Their story had become bigger than either of them had imagined, but at its heart it remained simple. When injustice occurs, good people must stand up and fight back, not with violence but with truth, determination, and the belief that things can always be better. As they went inside for the night, Robert paused to look at a new photo that sat beside the old one of David in his Navy uniform. This new picture showed father and son together at the community center dedication, surrounded by neighbors and friends who had become family through their shared commitment to justice. It was, Robert thought, the perfect ending to a story that had begun with hatred but had grown into something beautiful. A community united in the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, and that when people work together, they can create the change they want to see in the world.